Greetings, everyone. This is Daniel Gregg speaking, and today is the 26th day of the month of Av in the year 6162. It's also the 37th year of the Jubilee cycle and the second year of the 7-year sabbatical cycle. In this video, I'm going to calculate for you when the year of Jubilee is, the year that comes after 7 sabbatical cycles of seven-year periods would be the 49th year, and then the year after that will be the Jubilee year. So this video is going to be about calculating when it is, and if you remember the chart that I had from the last time we had our video up, I had the end time last 7 of Daniel's 70th 7 off in the future, and I put a Jubilee at the end of it. But I told you it could be a Jubilee and that the last 7 would begin in the 43rd year of a cycle, but what I did not tell you is when that Jubilee could be. Okay, so in this video we're going to find out when the Jubilee year could be. Okay, and so that's why I've given you a little clue here in my introduction with the dating. Okay, so knowing when the sabbatical year is, which I've demonstrated in the outline of Daniel 9 in the past videos, it will be easier for us to find out when the year of Jubilee is, because a Jubilee year can only come after a sabbatical year. So we only have to look in certain places after the 7th year for a potential Jubilee year. Okay, so the chart from Daniel 9 is here. I posted it on the screen for you. In 445 BC is when Nehemiah reconstructed the city and built the city walls. Starting in Tishri that year was a sabbatical year. And then we count 7 sevens or 7 sabbatical years, and we come to Ezra. Ezra brought his reform of the temple from Artaxerxes II after 7 sabbatical years. And then we go another 62 sabbatical periods, and we come to the second anointed, which is Yeshua, our Messiah. And after this, he was cut off. And then we have an indeterminate gap in the future until the 70th 7, when the clock will start again. I've discussed in past videos the phenomenon of clock stopping and starting in the divine timekeeping of matters. So you can listen to those videos if you don't quite understand that. So the last 7 is over here at the end of the chart, and we see that it has a Jubilee year at the end of it. Okay, so by knowing when the Jubilee is, we can refine the scenario as only occurring, as the potential for it only occurring where there's a Jubilee at the end of the cycle. Okay, so we have to go back into the chronology of Scripture in order to find out when the Jubilee is. All right. There are, in fact, 2 different systems of Jubilee calculation in the literature coming from the rabbis and from 2 different points of view. One system, which is the more popular because people assume that it's correct, is to count 1 to 50 years and then start over after the 50th year, counting a new 50 years. The second system, which is less popular, involves counting up to the 49th year, and the 50th year will be the first year of the next cycle also. So the cycles only last 49 years, and then the year after the 49th is a Jubilee, as inclusively counted with the first year of the next cycle. Okay, so from our study of Daniel 9, we can tell which of these systems is correct, because in the first system I mentioned, where we have a non-inclusive counting, the 7th year cycle or the sabbatical year is bumped 1 year ahead on each cycle. So If you take this and you apply it to the Daniel 9 passage, after the 7 sevens, it would bump ahead 1 year. And then after the 62 sevens, it would bump ahead several more years. I have calculated exactly how many years the cycle would bump ahead. It would bump ahead by 10 years if we use the method of non-inclusive counting. And what this would do is it would put the 62nd sabbatical year in the year 42/43 AD. Okay, and this date is well after any possible dates for Yeshua's death and resurrection, meaning there would not be a sufficient number of sabbatical periods between in the interval to satisfy the prophecy. So the prophecy is only satisfied by counting 1 to 49 and then the 50th year, and then we inclusively count for the next cycle. Now, there is a precedent for this type of thinking. In the scripture, when it's talking about counting off the sabbatical year, it talks about the 8th and 9th years. This is a way of referring to the year after the 7th year and the year after the 2 years after the 7th year, when they would be bringing in the new produce and throwing out the old because of the abundance, because they were obeying God and observing his sabbatical cycles. So you see, the 8th year and the 9th year are only a means of referring to the year that comes after the 7th year. It's not telling us that we should start counting a new sabbatical cycle in the year after the 9th year or the year after the 8th year. So likewise, the Jubilee cycle is the same way. The 50th year is a way of referring to the year after the 49th year. It's not telling us to start counting after the 50th year. Okay, so now that I've explained it, Daniel 9 only works with the one method. We can settle on that method. And this is a method which will prove to be correct in overall biblical chronology. Okay, so now we have to identify some places in Scripture to look for the Jubilee. There is only one obvious and objective place to look in Scripture for the Jubilee, and that is counting 50 years after they came into the land of Israel. All right, so deriving the Jubilee from this method is possible, and that's how I originally derived the Jubilee, but it's complicated. There is a simpler method to doing this, and we're going to use that simpler method today. The other places where the Jubilee is mentioned in Scripture it is mentioned in parabolic or cryptic form. And if we can understand the allusion to the Jubilee, then we can understand that it's a Jubilee year. Okay, these places are 1 Samuel 13, 1 through 3, and 2 Kings 19, 29, and a parallel passage in the book of Isaiah, and Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1. So I'm going to concentrate for the start on the 2 Kings 19:29 passage. Okay, so I'm going to go back to chapter 18 and verse 13 to start talking about this instance or allusion to a sabbatical year. 18:13, it says, "In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them." So the important point here is the dating in the 14th year. And what transpired next was Hezekiah tried to give the king of Assyria a very large present of tribute in order to get him to turn away from attacking him. But this seemingly did not work because the king of Assyria sent a very large and powerful army up against Jerusalem. And the commander of that army began taunting Judah, telling them that they couldn't fight against him. And obviously they wanted the city to surrender to the king of Assyria and let it become an Assyrian possession and an Assyrian province. Tribute was not enough to get the king of Assyria to turn his armies away from Judah. At this point, the narrative proceeds to say that the general of the Assyrian army was called away to see what the king of Assyria was doing. And while he was gone, he sent a letter to Hezekiah, threatening him again and threatening Jerusalem. And Hezekiah took this letter and laid it out before the Almighty as to what to do about it or to do with it. And the Almighty gave an answer through the prophet Isaiah. And this answer is where we find our allusion to the sabbatical and Jubilee year. So I will now read you 19 verse 29. Okay, so this is part of the answer. And this shall be the sign for you. This year eat what grows of itself, and in the second year eat what springs of the same. Then in the third year sow and reap, and plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. Okay, so this is an allusion to the sabbatical year legislation, and I want to read that next, just to review it for you. This is in Leviticus chapter 25. Okay, so the Leviticus passage that I have here is on the sabbatical and Jubilee year legislation, and I'm going to read it to you. Leviticus 25, starting in verse 1. Yahweh said to Moshe on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to Yahweh. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to Yahweh. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself, and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker, and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle, and for the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be for food." So what it means is they were not supposed to reap the land for commercial or market use, or to sow it, or for those purposes, but they could eat what the aftergrowth was left over that grew wild off of the land to live during that year. Okay, if they hadn't actually stored up any food, that would be for the poor and for the animals. Okay, the year of Jubilee. You shall count 7 sevens of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 sevens of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound, okay, then back up, this translation's a little poor. You shall count 7 Sabbaths of the years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of 7 Sabbaths of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day on the 7th of the 7th month. On the day of purging you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather grapes from the undressed vines. For in the jubilee it shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. Okay, so here again, they're not to use any of the stuff in the normal commercial or market way. They're not to reap a profit off of the land, but they can only reap what grows of itself. In other words, the aftergrowth. Okay, so now that we have this background on the sabbatical and Jubilee year, we can go back to 2 Kings 19:29 and see what it says there. And this shall be the sign for you. This year eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs of the same. Then in the third year sow and reap, and plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. Okay, so this is an allusion to what they're supposed to do in the sabbatical and Jubilee year. The prophet picks up the same language from the legislation concerning these 2 years, and he repeats it to Hezekiah. And he repeats it immediately after his 14 years and the events that transpired with the threat against Jerusalem brought by the king of Assyria. So they will be able, after the Assyrians have ravaged the land, to eat what grows of itself in the first year and in the second year. So this is clearly an allusion to a combination of sabbatical year followed by the Jubilee year. And in the third year, they are told that they can sow and plant. Okay, so it was prohibited to sow and plant during those 2 years. So this is the prophecy which alludes to the legislation. All right, so what we want to do now is calculate this Jubilee year. This Jubilee and sabbatical year combination came immediately after the 14th year of Hezekiah. But as we shall see, we only have to be close in order to get perfect results. All right, so according to scholars, the siege of Samaria, or the fall of Samaria, was in the range of the years 723 BC to 718 BC. And we will see, or I should state rather, because I'm not going to demonstrate it here and now, that any one of these choices will give the same result. And the reason for that is because we already know when the sabbatical year is. We just have to be close to the right sabbatical year in order for it to work. And we know what the right sabbatical year is. So if it's not too far off, then we'll be able to zero in on the Jubilee year, using what we already know about the sabbatical year. So the opinion that I have settled on for the siege of Samaria is 720 BC. And this is, or the culmination or the end of the siege of Samaria. And this is an opinion that's quite popular, and it was published by Gershon Galil, and also it's supported by a guy named Rob Andrew Young. Okay, these people both wrote books. Alrighty, and it also works out from the internal chronology of Scripture. Alright, the reason that the siege of Samaria is important because Scripture provides us with the synchronism. The end of the siege of Samaria was in the 6th year of Hezekiah, king of Judah. And as you can see, this will enable us to calculate the 14th year of Hezekiah. So if to go from the 6th year to the 14th year, we need to add 8 years to this. So this would bring us down to 712 BC. All right, so that the 14th year is actually 712 Tishri to 711 Tishri, 711 BC. Okay, so we add the 8 years and we can find out when the 14th year of the king was. So the years after that we want to check, we want to find out, we already know that the sabbatical year in this vicinity is the year 711 Tishri to 7, let me check it out here. The sabbatical year was in 711 Tishri to 710 Tishri. And the Jubilee year would have to be the year immediately after that. Okay, so by knowing when the sabbatical year is, we have the solid identification on when the Jubilee year, it's in the year after this sabbatical year. All right. The next Jubilee allusion we want to talk about is in 1 Samuel 13, 1 through 3, and I will read that to you. All right. I'm going to have to ad-lib from the Hebrew a little bit here because the ESV is off base. Okay, so Saul was the son of the year. Yea, he reigned 2 years over Israel. So this is a way of saying that he was in the second year of his reign. Okay, Saul chose 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home, every man to his tent. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. Okay, so this phrase, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, is a direct reference to the year of Jubilee. Because if we look back here in Leviticus chapter 25, remind you of what that says. It says here, and you shall, let's see, on the day of the atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. So that's an allusion to the Jubilee. Okay, so now the question is when was the second year of Saul? So we can check the calculations here. All right, so the best way to go about this is to use the long numbers in Scripture. All right, and so I'm going to have to tell you our starting point is going to start in the Neo-Babylonian Empire period. All right, and the reason this works is because there were two discoveries or developments in the history of chronology that were historic chronology that were really important. The first of these developments was the invention of calculus by Sir Isaac Newton and a French mathematician, which enabled astronomers to finally be able to calculate and predict when the positions of the sun and the moon and the planets would be, going far into the past and far into the future. The second important development that came about was the discovery of astronomical records in the Neo-Babylonian archives called the Babylonian Chronicle and the observations that they made in their tablets. And this was conducted by archaeological research. And when the observations were checked by the newest astronomical ability to calculate when these things happen, the recorded positions of the planets checked with the historical dates and cross-reference with them, so that the chronology of the Neo-Babylonian Empire is nailed down in astronomical cement, so to speak. All right, so another interesting observation that should be made is that Scripture never dates anything in the terms of the reign of a foreign king or a pharaoh of any nation until the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And then Scripture starts using Neo-Babylonian and Persian dates, skipping over the Greek period, and then in the New Testament there's a reference to a Roman date. All right, and the reason for this is because dating anything in the terms of a foreign nation would be completely unreliable before the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is why the Scripture refrained from doing this. But the Babylonians wanted to establish their chronology and cement, so they made astronomical observations in conjunction with their historical records that put the name of the king on the tablet and his regnal years. So, and Scripture starts using the dates of Nebuchadnezzar in the period in which they started doing this. So we know absolutely when the years of King Nebuchadnezzar are. Okay, so our starting point is going to be when Nebuchadnezzar came down to Jerusalem and conquered it and took Jehoiakim captive. This was in his 7th year in 597 BC. And the Babylonian Chronicle even gives a date. It's the second day of the month of Adar. All right. So we know when the exile of Jehoiakim began. It began in the spring of 597 BC. All right. The passage in Ezekiel chapter 1 is dated in the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. All right. And so if we count inclusively 5 years from 597, we can count the first year of exile as 597, the second year of the exile as 596, the third year as 595, the fourth year is 594, and the fifth year as 593. Okay, so this is how Ezekiel 1:1 is dated. All right, so when we come to Ezekiel chapter 4, which is in the same year, Ezekiel was given instructions to lie on one side 390 days and on the other side 40 days. The 390 days are a day for a year in this passage for the sin of Israel. Okay, so there's two interpretations of the sin of Israel that work out to be valid, but the one I want to use here is the rebellion of Israel against the kingdom of Judah when the kingdom split. Okay, so in the eyes of Judah, this was the sin of Israel. All right, so I consider this year when the prophecy when Ezekiel was given these instructions to be the 390th year on this time scale. So all we have to do is add 390 years to get back to the division of the kingdom. So since Ezekiel was given these instructions in chapter 4 in 593 BC, which we have said is solidly tied to Neo-Babylonian chronology and hence to astronomical dating, all we have to do is add 390 years to 593 BC. And what we come up with is we come up with 983 BC for the first year of King Rehoboam. All right, so in order to get back to the second year of King Saul, we have to add 40 more years for Saul, 40 years for David, and we get back to the first year of Saul by adding 40 years. So we add 120 years to this figure. So we come out to 1103 BC when we add these years to it. So the first year of Saul is going to be 1103 BC Tishri to 1102 BC Tishri, and the second year of his reign is going to be 1102 Tishri to 1101 Tishri. So this is the year that the Jubilee allusion is made to. So what we want to do here now to confirm our calculations is to see if this Jubilee under King Saul agrees with the Jubilee that we determined from Hezekiah. So the Jubilee for King Saul is 1102, 1101, and the Jubilee from Hezekiah is 7, let me check this out here, make sure I'm remembering it off the top of my head here. Okay, so the Jubilee in the time of Hezekiah was 710, 709. Okay, so in order to do the calculation to check it, we have to subtract the 2 years, one from the other. Okay, I'm going to put that up on the screen here for you. If I put the problem here in print. Okay. Here's the check. Oh, I did that check there. Okay, so 1102 is the year that begins the Jubilee, beginning the second year of Saul, and 710 is the year that begins the Jubilee mentioned under Hezekiah. So 1102 minus 710 is 392. Okay, and 392 years is exactly 8 Jubilee cycles, or 8 times 49. Okay, so we see that that checks out. All right, so we've synchronized the Jubilee under Saul, or we've confirmed that it is synchronized, the Jubilee under King Saul, and the Jubilee mentioned under Hezekiah. Now, we have, so that's the cryptic statements alluding to a Jubilee in 1 Samuel 13, 1 through 3, and 2 Kings 19, verse 29. Okay, so there's another allusion to the Jubilee in the book of Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, let's go over there. It says here, the words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. Okay, so then he asked them about their news and what happened. Okay, but the important thing to notice here is that this 20th year doesn't come designated as the year of any king. It's just stated that it's the 20th year. Okay, so we know that it wasn't the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, because if you look in chapter 2, it says in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. And it's known from the Babylonian and Persian records that the Babylonian and the Persian kings began their regnal years in the spring with the month of Nisan. So one day immediately before the new moon of the month of Nisan would have been the 19th year of Artaxerxes. So what's stated in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1 in the 20th year happened in the 19th year of Artaxerxes. So now about the only era that one could talk about without saying exactly what it is, having a length of 20 years, would be the Jubilee cycle. So what I believe this is an allusion to the Jubilee put in here cryptically, like our other two passages, the one from Samuel and the one from 2 Kings, okay, to tell us when the Jubilee is. All right, so we know that the year 445/444 was sabbatic, okay, and if the year before it, in 446 BC, was the 20th year of the Jubilee cycle, then obviously the next year would be sabbatic, because the 21st year of a Jubilee cycle is sabbatic. Years 7, 14, 21, and so on of the Jubilee cycle are sabbatic. So the year before the third sabbatical year of the cycle is the 20th year of the Jubilee cycle. So now what we want to do is we want to see if this Jubilee illusion synchronizes with our other two Jubilee synchronizations. So since it's the 20th year of a cycle, in order to find the actual year of Jubilee, we have to add 30 more years to it. So if we go forward in the chronology by 30 years, we're going to come to, we're going to come to the year 416 Tishri to 415 BC Tishri. Okay, so we can check this against both of our known sabbatic years. All right, so let's check it against the 2 Kings 1929 Jubilee year. And that would be, let's see. No, we're not going to check it that way first. We'll check it against the second year of Saul first, okay? And that would be the year 1102/1101 BC. So we use the beginning of each Jubilee year as our check. So 1102 minus 416 BC is 686 years. Okay, and 686 years is exactly 14 Jubilee cycles, or 14 times 49. Okay, so we can also check this. Okay, and then we could check it with the 2 Kings 19:29. Okay, so we want to do the calculation between Hezekiah's Jubilee and the one alluded to in Nehemiah. All right, so the start year for the Jubilee in Hezekiah's time is 710, and the start year for the Jubilee in Nehemiah's time is 416. So now we do the math. 710 minus 416 is equal to 294. All right, and then we take the 294 and we divide it by 49, and we find out that that's exactly 6 Jubilee cycles. All right. Okay, so we see that we have 3 cryptic notices of a Jubilee, one with the 2nd year of Saul in 1 Samuel 13, one with Hezekiah in 2 Kings 19:29, and one with Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1. And we've seen from calculations that all 3 of these Jubilees are indeed on the exact same Jubilee cycle and have an even number of Jubilees between each point. We don't have to have the sabbatical year, knowing this beforehand, has zeroed us into which year to pick for the Jubilee year. And we find that the Neo-Babylonian chronology and a simple adding up of 390 years to find the division of the kingdom, and then going back 120 years for the reigns of Solomon, David, and Saul, gives us a very simple and elegant way of checking the matter. And we find that using the archaeological findings on the siege of Samaria and those possible dates lead us to the synchronous Jubilee in the year 710, 709 BC. And we find that using the accepted date for Nehemiah going to Jerusalem and for him hearing the news from his brother, that indeed was a 20th year of the synchronous Jubilee cycle at the time. All right, so now I want to add a few more points here. We could start in 597 BC, or better yet, we could start with the death of Josiah in 609 BC, a few years before, and his reign was 31 years. So we can add his 31 years, and then the 2 years of Ammon, his father, and 55 years of Manasseh, and 29 years of Hezekiah, and then we could come back down 14 years of Hezekiah to end up with essentially the same results using biblical regnal data alone without relying on the 2 scholars that I mentioned. All right, there are several Jubilees that I didn't mention. There are several Jubilees that I didn't mention, but their calculation is more complicated. All right. So first I want to tell you what this means for our eschatological chart here. So I'll put that back up on the screen here. And what that means is that the next 3 Jubilees are the following years. Okay, so I'll list those over near the end of the chart on the right hand side. And these are the years 2035 AD Tishri, or the 7th month, to the year 2036 Tishri. The second Jubilee from now will be 2084 Tishri to 2085 Tishri, and the third Jubilee will be 2133 Tishri to 2134 Tishri. So now I'm going to check this last instance here. Let's do a math problem here with the astronomer's method, just to make sure that this is on the same cycle that we're talking about. Okay, so in astronomer's arithmetic, which I talked about in our last video, Saul's Jubilee 1102/1101 BC converts to minus 1101/minus 1100 BC. Okay, so now you can use the negative numbers. So we'll start with the greater year in the year more recently, that is 2133 BC, which leads off the Jubilee, and we'll subtract it out with Saul's Jubilee. So the arithmetic here is 2133 minus a negative 1101 BC. And of course, in integer arithmetic, when you have a double negative like this, the rule would be you add the opposite. Okay, so the opposite of minus 1101 BC is 1101, so we're going to add 1101. So 2133 plus 1101 equals 3,234 years. Okay, so now we can divide this 3,234 years by 49, and we'll find that it's exactly 66 Jubilee cycles. Okay. Okay, so now I've been using these Jubilee illusions to show you when the Jubilee year is. When I actually first discovered the Jubilee, and I think I mentioned this before, I worked it out on the basis of when Israel came into the land. All right, but that's more complicated. All right. Okay, so a little note here is that I was told, someone else educated me about the Hezekiah Jubilee. So I was told about that one, and I've worked that out in my chronology. After my chronology was worked out, I discovered the allusion to the Jubilee in the second year of Saul when I was reading the Hebrew and comparing it with Leviticus 25, and I said, this sounds like a Jubilee allusion. And so it was with some trepidation that I went to check out what my chronology already had, and I was thrilled to see that it was in the exact same year, right where I had the second year of Saul, where it was supposed to be. And also the Nehemiah 1:1 synchronization, that being stating the 20th year of the Jubilee cycle, I came up with that on my own, and that was after going through and debunking the idea that there's a Tishri Nisan shift going on anywhere in biblical chronology. Actually, there isn't. This explanation is completely unnecessary. When Scripture gives synchronizations, even if nations use different regnal years, the synchronization will be good for the part of the year in which it's stated in both corresponding nations using the different regnal years. The synchronization will be valid. There's no such thing as shifting a year from one to another year. In other words, if Israel and if Judah use a Tishri year and Persia uses a Nisan year, then the 20th year of Artaxerxes will only be stated for the parts of the year, actual time in which the connection is valid. So we can't say that the 20th year of Artaxerxes occurred before Nisan of 445 BC, because that would contradict the Persian method. We could only say that the 20th year in terms of the Jubilee count, Jewish or Tishri calendar, was valid for half of the year of Artaxerxes' 20th year. Okay, so if you look at all the scriptural synchronisms en masse, which I have done, this is never a necessary methodology, not even between the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. So when I realized that the only last piece of datum standing for this claim was the Nehemiah 1:1 passage, I realized that this must be like the other two allusions, another allusion to the Jubilee year. All right, so some background on the starting point for my chronology. The starting point for my chronological research was David L. Cooper's book called Messiah, His First Coming Scheduled. And so I use that as the structure of the first chronology I did. Okay, and then he uses Martin Ansey's The Romance of Biblical Chronology. And so I got that work and studied it also and discovered that it only needed a 20-year correction for the date of Exodus. And this was the second Philistine servitude. And then subsequently, I discovered the chronology of Willis Judson Beecher, who had identical dates as these other two chronologies. And this was in the period when they were relying on the biblical text alone and making the chronology on that basis without trying to insert the opinions of secular archaeologists. Okay, so when the secular archaeologists came in, the church was divided between the scripture and the archaeology, and the interpretations of the archaeologists won the day, but incorrectly so. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all of that now. I'm just saying that my chronology wasn't invented out of thin air. All I've done is make some adjustments and some refinements based on my knowledge of Hebrew and the Daniel 9 passage and the sabbatical year. Okay, so after making the aforementioned correction to Martin Ansey's chronology, he omitted the second Philistine oppression, which is implied in the sojourn of the ark of 20 years mentioned in the book of 1 Samuel. All right, so when you add these 20 years back, which is absolutely necessary because it's necessary to complete the other interpretation of the 390 years for the sin of Israel, you end up with moving his Exodus date from 1612 BC back to 1632 BC, which is when it actually is. And in that year, I did astronomical calculations on the festival dates and found out the festival dates come out on the correct days of the week. Shavuot, for instance, comes out on the Sabbath day because it says that Moses, after Shavuot, went up on the mountain. For 6 days, the cloud was over the mountain, and then the Lord spoke with him on the seventh day. Okay, so that would be the weekly Sabbath, implying that the previous feast day, Shavuot, was also on the Sabbath. So we can astronomically calculate that out. So that works out. Okay, so after correcting Martin Ansey's chronology, it's by the 20 years, we can now determine when they entered into the land of Israel, and that would be in the year 1593, 1592 BC, and then we can count forward and be a little more exact for you here. Okay. Look through the chronology book here. So the Exodus was in 1632 BC, and they came into the land in, let's see here. Okay, so crossing the Jordan. (1592 BC). Yeah, okay, 1592 BC in the spring in Nisan. Okay, so that corresponds to the 7th year, and then the beginning of the Jubilee period is the year immediately after that. So it says, when you come into the land will observe a Sabbath. So that was the sabbatical year. And then the Jubilee cycle followed that. Of course, this is a proleptic Jubilee, which means before they were supposed to observe it. So there are 6 years there, 6 years in which they could sow and plant. So they couldn't sow until the fall of the year after which they came in. So they sowed for 6 years after that and reaped. So we come down to the first Jubilee in 1543/1542 BC. So that's how I originally worked out when the Jubilee was, okay, using Martin Ansey's chronology with a correction to it, okay? So, and then I discovered these other illusions afterward. All right, so here are some more Jubilees for you, okay? So I'll list them off, okay? The 50th year after creation, and this is on the same cycle. It also synchronizes. All the internal data lines up to the year Joseph returned the land to Egypt. Okay, after the 7 years of famine and the seven years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, there was a jubilee after that when Joseph returned the land to the people. Okay, 50th year after coming into the land, the second year of King Saul, the 16th year of King Hezekiah, the fall of Nineveh, there's a Jubilee allusion there, the restoration of Nebuchadnezzar, also there, and the report of Hananiah to Nehemiah was in the 20th year of the Jubilee cycle. Okay, so I first figure number 3 on the list, that's the 50th year of the coming in the last, and then I was told coming into the land, and I was told about number 5, which is Hezekiah's Jubilee. I think I learned about that from a David Logren, who published some stuff on the calendar way back in, way back. Some people might know who he is. Okay, so the rest is the result of my research. Okay, so I want to show you here how close Willis Justin Beecher came to our benchmark dates here. Okay, at 446, he has the 19th year of Artaxerxes, and then I want to show you how close he comes to aligning Hezekiah's 14th year with the following Sabbatic and Jubilee years. Okay, and then I want to show you here how Beecher's chronology lines up with Saul's second year here. Okay, so I've put that up on the screen for you, and I've zoomed into those years and circled them just to show you that that lines up. And the reason I'm showing you this, background to my research is to convince you that it's not a pious fraud. I've actually built on the shoulders of others and sound research that went before me. Okay, the dates of these passages were established in Cooper, Ansey, and Beecher. Okay. There are a lot of pious frauds out there invented by religious hucksters that are good at playing games with numbers. Okay. And presenting magical synchronisms, or what I would call magical synchronisms. Okay, because they have no basis in reality other than the circularity of their reasoning. All right. So that's why I'm showing you this background information. Okay. So I reported on the coming 3 Jubilees, and the real reason for knowing when the Jubilee year is because when the house of Israel returns to the land, we will need to observe the Jubilee, and we will need to know when it is. So besides for knowing potential endpoints for Daniel's 70th 7, which I gave you in the 3 coming Jubilees, we need to know when the Jubilee is so that we can observe it. Okay, so you can get my chronology books on Amazon. I've got volume 1 and 2 of the Scroll of Biblical Chronology and Ancient Near Eastern History. I've got the Resurrection Day book, and I've also got the Good News of Messiah translation. You can find these books on my website. I generally use that for when people want to order combinations of books or bulk orders. But my website takes longer because I'm not as fast as Amazon or the other companies that sell my books out there and getting the books to you. All right, so thank you for listening. Daniel Gregg Over and out.